the ghost story. The moral of this, the 16th card of our series, is that if young ladies would avoid creating a scene similar to the one the artist Mr. R.W. Buss gives us in this admirable picture, they had better forego reading ghost stories at bedtime. Les Petits Châteaux de Versailles. April 22nd, 1885. Dear Lily, my dear girl, I won't hear a word of it. Throwing that wedding dinner for you and your dear sister was one of the highlights of my career as an entertainer. But I do hope you didn't mind the extravagant costumery at such a pious event. Dear me, the look on Mr. DeMille's face when I came out in my feathers and crimson silk was, well, quite delightful, if I'm being honest. Oh, he's the best of men. But really, Lil, it's too bad some of those Mormons take themselves so dang seriously. Besides, isn't it their book that says, men are that they might have joy? Well, weddings, feathers, and crimson silk bring me a great deal of joy. That and, of course, seeing you and that dear, dear Mr. Hickman so blissfully happy together. Truly, my dear, I couldn't have picked a better woman for him even if my Lizzie was still alive. Oh, it's no secret she was sweet on him, but she was far too practical for the likes of Mr. Hickman. He needs a woman with a bit of fire and whimsy in her to keep him from aging too quickly. You're full to the brim with both. Believe me, I've known Matthew for a few years now. Since he found you, he looks years younger and less weathered than I've ever seen him. Keep him young for as long as you can. Young-hearted husbands make the best lovers. And now I will answer your question and tell you what I know about our white widow, or as you have rightly guessed, our poor baker, Bianca Canuto. As you may have surmised, her husband was the late Mr. Oliver Snipe, who was disgracefully lynched the day you arrived in Frisco. Canuto was her maiden name, which was why Sheriff Pearson was never able to track down her sister in Beaver. Unlike the rest of the townfolk, I knew Bianca because she had worked for me as a baker for a few months before she met and married Mr. Snipe. After she married, however, she was ever away from town, helping her sister, who was often poorly. With always being gone, and the constant turnaround in Frisco, not to mention her discreet nature, it was no wonder no one in town ever recognized Bianca as Mr. Snipe's widow. I was actually the one who invited her back to Frisco, you see. I offered her job back, and she agreed to come if I kept her connection to Mr. Snipe a secret. Of course, I agreed, thinking it was only natural for one with her nature to desire privacy and anonymity, while she grieved the tragic death of her husband. I was at the train station that day specifically to meet her. It wasn't random like I allowed you to believe. Although I have gone to the train station often enough to find girls in need of a mother hen. Bianca hadn't been here long when she came to my rooms and told me she had letters. Letters that proved her husband hadn't been cooking the books, as Mr. Gambit led that mob to believe. In fact, the only thing Mr. Snipe was guilty of was that he had discovered corners being cut in the shoring up of the mine. Thousands of men's lives were being needlessly put at risk every day due to a couple of men's greed. When Bianca told me she knew Gambit was behind it all, that he'd framed Snipe for underhanded dealings because he threatened to expose Gambit for covering up those 4 deaths, I agreed to continue helping her maintain anonymity until she could get to the bottom of things. Please believe me when I tell you I had no idea how she intended to get to that bottom of things until that night you found me quite indisposed with grief in my rooms. The night I told you about my brothers and sisters' murders. But by then I was too entrenched in it to go to the law. And what law was there to go to? When Sheriff Pearson finally arrived, however, I knew a dress and everyone believed you were the White Widow. I can't tell you how distressed I was for you. How could I ever look Mr. Hickman in the face again if anything happened to you? So I stole into Bianca's room and took her husband's and had to do something, especially when Gambit found your wedding letters. I made sure Sheriff Pearson found them. I knew if your Mr. Hickman had recommended the sheriff, then Pearson could be trusted to get to the bottom of things, even if he discovered I was involved and ended up taking me down as well. When Bianca fell during the mine collapse, I knew you'd recognized her. White powder couldn't disguise hair that black in broad daylight. My heart breaks for the poor girl, and I do wish I could have saved her from herself. I don't believe Gambit and his men deserve to die at her hand, but I'm also not sure any of them would have been served justice if it had been left in the hands of the law, especially not if that horrid Captain Rigby, with all his Chicago connections, had anything to say about it. Having gone through what I have with my siblings and nieces, I don't believe I have much faith left in the justice system. But if enough men and women like your Mr. Hickman, Sheriff Pearson, and my sister Lizzie keep fighting the good fight, perhaps that will change one day. In the meantime, it's probably best that my nieces were never recovered when the mine crashed, even if I shall miss them terribly. As to Bianca, I fear her revenge hasn't brought her any peace. The poor, poor, wretched soul. You see, since you all left Frisco, rumors have cropped up around town that the White Widow has been spotted roaming the foothills near her husband's grave. As a matter of fact, I was up there just last evening, leaving flowers on Lizzie's grave, when I saw her myself. She looked so forlorn and wretched, and I fear her poor soul won't be allowed any peace or rest until Judgment Day. May God have mercy on her. But I refuse to end this letter on such a sad note. Instead, I will end by telling you I've decided to hold my last show next month, and then I'm going to close for good. I've taken your advice. I think it's time for me to head back to California. My final show will have a ghostly theme, which I believe is quite fitting, all things considered, if not slightly morbid. Frisco will be a town of more ghosts than our poor White Widow soon enough anyway. Besides, people of all backgrounds tend to be fascinated with the macabre these days. And perhaps the show will bring in a few extra audience members from Beaver. If only you had stayed long enough to help me realize my final piece de resistance, my dear. Ah, well, in the meantime, as these Mormons say in parting, God be with you till we meet again. Ever yours, Lottie.